So these are the top 5 best decks in Hearthstone, brought to you by Hype Horizon. We have a link down below that'll take you to the entire tier list page if you want to know mulligans and a basic description of everything. So let's just jump into it. The first one is going to be Ty's Beast Hunter. This deck is just extremely strong and has the highest win rate in the game by a wide margin. It is 2 to 2.5% of a higher win rate over the next highest deck, and it's because, look at this, you have an insane early game with most of your cards being 3 or less mana. But then you also have 7 late game bombs, as well as Tavish, which is also a late game bomb. So 8 that could potentially win you the game on their own, each of them, except maybe the Mountain Bear, which is more of a just tempoed out card, a lot of stats. Overall, this deck just has no weakness. It's strong at every point in the game, and the only thing it loses to is burn decks, but there aren't that many out there right now. So the next deck on the list is going to be Imp Curse Lock, which is very similar to Beast Hunter in the sense that it doesn't really have a point where it is weak in the game. It has really good early game because you have the Imp package, and then it has a really good late game because your curses can do upwards of 36 or more damage relatively easily, and that is assuming they instantly play every single curse that you give them, which is not always going to happen because of mana costs. Overall, this deck just has a lot of good removal with things like Grimmer's Sacrifice, Dragged Below, and Abyssal Wave if you're into something aggressive, but also has a ton of tempo and late game power. The next deck on this list is a little bit weird, but it's going to be Thief Control Priest because it has an insane amount of removal. So basically any deck in the game that doesn't have an insane late game win condition loses. Face Hunter loses, Naga Priest usually loses because you have silence and good removal. Imp Warlock usually loses. You get the general idea. The only thing this loses to is really high value late game decks. Also, Aggro Druid loses to this really hard. But those decks aren't actually that big of a problem because you steal their win condition. It's not super reliable, but this deck has actually proven, at least for me, to be pretty good. I think I ended up going like 5-2 with it, which is a small sample size, but I really liked the deck when I played it. And if you like a control style of deck, this is definitely the one for you. The next deck on this list is actually going to be Aggro Druid, which we just briefly talked about in the last section. And the reason this is on the list is even though it might not be quite as just overtly strong as some of the other decks on this list, it is by far the cheapest. So basically anybody who wants the strongest deck possible on a budget, this is the best deck for you. This deck requires literally only 1 epic composting, and you don't even need it. Some decks run a more aggressive all-in package that runs something like the Peasant, or instead you could run something like Mark of the Wild in order to get a little bit of extra tempo out there, or Natural Causes, which are both significantly cheaper than the epic composting. And then the idea of this deck is to just flood the board as quickly as possible, pump them up with the Power of the Wild, Herald of Nature, and Pride's Fury, and just overwhelm them and hope your board doesn't get wiped. The last deck on this list before we get into the honorable mentions is going to be Ramp Druid. And Ramp Druid is strong it's like situationally strong. And the reason I say this is because the Guff nerf did hit it hard, but because the meta is slowing down and becoming a little bit more greedy, revolving a lot around the Demon Hunter, Relic Demon Hunter build, as well as some more control quest priests, and even some slower mage decks, this deck is just able to get to its late game more reliably, which means even though it's weaker, its position in the meta is better, which means it averages out and stays at about the same power level, in my opinion. Yes, this deck does still lose to aggro, so something like Face Hunter or Aggro Druid might overwhelm you. But even then, if they have a slow start and or you have good ramp in the beginning, you drop Scale of Onyxia, you stabilize the board, gain a ton of armor with Earth and Scales, and you can still win a game in a losing matchup. This deck has just a lot of answers to a lot of things and is very flexible late game. So for the honorable mentions, we are going to start off with Relic Demon Hunter, which, if we took out the fact that Aggro Druid is a great budget deck, would be on this list of top 5. Basically, this is number 6. It's extremely strong, super popular. It has a lot of really cool, flexible late game win conditions. The only weakness is it dies really fast to some aggro decks because you don't have that much healing, which can be bad. The next decks on this list are going to be Control Shaman, which has good disruption and a lot of flexible late game win conditions. Face Hunter, which has the 3rd highest win rate deck in the entire game, but can feel inconsistent at times if you just draw poorly and don't have a good early game. Then we're going to have Extra Large Thief Rogue, which has been doing really well on ladder. The only reason I don't have it on this list is because I haven't personally tried it out yet, but I hear and have played against it, so it seems pretty strong. And then the last thing on this list is going to be just normal Imp Warlock. It's able to develop a board very quickly like aggro Druid, and it has the ability to win the game even in the late game because you have more card draw, but it doesn't snowball quite as hard as aggro Druid, which can sometimes actually make it worse. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this list. Again, in the description there will be a link to all of the deck lists that I just said except the honorable mentions, and see you in the next one.